often asked about wine shows, how to go, what they mean, what do the medals mean. So I wanted to take this opportunity to sort of chat a bit about them. Basically, there are two main types of shows. One is the national shows. They're generally held in the capital cities of each state, and they're part of that city's or that state's Royal Agricultural Show. So we've got Perth, Melbourne, Sydney, and so on. And those shows, they invite interest from all across Australia. So anyone in the whole of Australia can become part of that. And they'll be big. I mean, I know the Perth show, I think last year they did over 2,500 entries. So the judging for that goes on for a week. The other sorts of shows you get are your local or regional shows. So the Swan Valley Wine Show is an example of that, or Mount Barker is another one too. And for those shows, it's just the local producers, so people who are growing grapes and making wine in that area. Generally, they're the only ones that are allowed to enter. So both shows have their advantages and disadvantages, or pros and cons. The local shows are terrific, and certainly in the Swan Valley, we all really enjoy doing it. Partly it's a social thing, because finally the industry does all get together. And there's a number of parts of that. First is you get your wines in, and then they do the judging, and that's a full day. The Swan Valley 2016, I think, had over 280 entries. And it's a mix of wines. So, for example, we have sparkling, so they had sparkling whites. Then they have dry table wines, and they'll all be done in different classes. So one class will be the Verdelho class, they'll have a Chenin Blanc class, they'll have a Oak-Aged Chardonnay class, and then they start to do classes for older wines, so 2015 and older, as opposed to new releases, which are 2016. So it's fairly complex putting your wines in. So we do that, and then they get them there, and they basically set up the day before, because wines are always tasted in the show at room temperature, so nothing's cold, so we can get all the flavours, because you tend to get bigger, the flavours are more obvious when they're at room temperature rather than actually chilled. So the judges will come in and they do it in teams, or panels they call them, and generally there's 3 judges in a panel. They'll have a panel leader who'll be the most senior, most experienced judge, and then there'll be 2 other judges that work with him, and all 3 of them will score. And generally as well, there'll be an associate judge who's basically a judge in training, and they want to develop their palate. They're not often winemakers, but there can be other people involved in the industry, and they want to increase and develop their wine knowledge. So all 4 of these guys, these judges, men or women, will judge the wine. They're all judged blind, and they'll taste them, and then they'll score them. And then at the end of a bracket, and I'm not sure how many people can bracket, but a certain number of wines, it will depend on the panel leader, so it could be 5 or 10. They will then discuss the results from those 5 or 10, and they'll basically tell each other what they pointed the wines at, and they generally score out of 20. So technically it's 5 for the colour of the wine, 5 points for the smell or the aroma of the wine, and 5 points for what it tastes like. 10 points for what it tastes like, so it's out of 20, but and that's the way it tends to work. So they will score their wines and they'll compare scores, and if they all pretty much agree, then they'll just keep moving on through the wines. But if there's any that they wildly disagree on, then they would obviously retaste the wines and check, relook at them. And that will depend on the panel leader. He's the one who's in charge each way that they do that. Okay, so that's the actual judging. They tend to taste about 200 wines in a day, 100 to 200 wines a day. So they spit everything. It certainly is a job. You've got to be equally critical and appreciative of the first wine and the last wine after you've had so many. So it is pretty onerous. They're all ready for a beer at the end of the day, generally, not a glass of wine. So in the local shows, let me rephrase. In the Swan Valley show, we'll have 2 panels, and they will each assess half the wines each, and it'll take a day. In the national shows, they have more like 6 or 8, probably 8 panels, and they will look at these 2,500 entries over the course of just under a week, maybe 5 or 6 days. And again, they'll only see certain classes. They won't all judge every wine, but they'll divide it up so that they judge different ones. But it works exactly the same way as the local show. The other thing that some people ask me about is, so what's the exhibitor's tasting? So that's the judging, and then the next thing we have is the exhibitor's tasting. you can only go if you get a ticket, and they give tickets out to people who enter wine. So part of your entry is that you get to look at the wines. And this was really the original reason why they started doing these wine shows, was because they wanted winemakers to be able to benchmark their products against those of, say, the local region or on a national basis. And so that's what's happened. So we, at the exhibitor tasting, always starts first thing in the morning, which is when your palate is freshest. So I think the Swan Valley one this year started at 8 o'clock. Perth normally starts about, they wanted there for 9, they give out the trophies, and then so we start tasting about 9:30. But then, as I say, your palate is at its freshest, it's most critical. So then we would try, go through the various classes, and we'll try the wines. So all the wines are displayed, they've got their medal stickers on, so we know what did well, we know what our wines are. We look at the top wine versus our wine, or what we're interested in, and compare and contrast. So it is a really interesting morning, and you have to stay pretty focused, because the other problem is everyone in the wine industry is there at the same time, and everyone's pretty happy for a chat, perhaps not for the first 40 minutes, but then after that people do sort of lose focus a bit. So yeah, that's all the fun of the show. They're not open to the public, and it would just be crazy if they were. It's normally a pretty confined space, and there's just such a lot of wine. So it is really for winemakers to look at their wines and benchmark against each other, see what they did well, what they want to improve on, how their competitors are doing, get a feel for the region. So that's wine shows.